What if the old beggar you saw on the street wasn't poor at all, but a billionaire in disguise? Searching for someone with a heart pure enough to join his family, she gave him a meal from her own pocket. And the world laughed at her. But in less than 48 hours, they'd all fall silent. When the truth turned the entire city upside down. Stick around, because this isn't just a story about wealth. It's about worth. The cafe buzzed with laughter and the clinking of coffee cups, but Lena moved through it like a shadow no one noticed. Her apron slightly faded, her shoes worn thin, yet her smile soft and sincere as she delivered orders with quiet grace. And while the other waitresses rolled their eyes or flirted with businessmen, she refilled water glasses without being asked, wiped down tables with gentle care, and paused every few minutes to check the time on the cheap plastic watch her mother gave her before passing away last year. A watch that had long stopped ticking, but which she still wore like it held her heart together. The other girls at the cafe mocked her kindness in whispers sharp enough to cut, calling her Mother Teresa or charity case behind her back. But Lena never fought back, never defended herself, because kindness had never been about being noticed. It had always been about doing what was right when no one else would. And then the bell above the door jingled, and the air shifted, ever so slightly, as an old man entered, his clothes ragged, shoes mismatched, beard wild, and a heavy canvas sack slung over his shoulder like a burden from another lifetime. The laughter died, conversations paused, eyes turned with instant judgment. A customer muttered, "Ugh, the homeless are getting bold these days." Another scoffed, "Why don't they just disappear?" But Lena watched the old man shuffle toward a corner booth, his hands trembling as he tried to sit, and her heart clenched. Not with pity, but with recognition, the way you recognize a soul that's been invisible for too long. While the manager hissed for someone to get rid of him before the customers complain, Lena had already filled a cup with hot tea and grabbed a warm pastry from the back, her favorite, the one she usually saved for herself, and walked over without hesitation, placing them gently in front of the old man as the entire cafe stared in disbelief. "Eat," she said softly, kneeling slightly so her eyes met his. "You're safe here." And in that moment, as the old man blinked at her like he couldn't remember the last time someone looked at him with kindness, something ancient and powerful passed silently between them. Something the rest of the world, too busy mocking, would soon come to regret ignoring. The cafe was no longer just a room full of noise and chatter. It had turned into a stage of quiet judgment, and all eyes burned into Lena's back as she crouched beside the old man, placing the tea just so, ensuring it wouldn't spill from his shaking hands. And when she gently unwrapped the pastry and pushed it toward him, her coworkers scoffed audibly from behind the counter, their mockery disguised as laughter, while customers whispered with sneers, filming her with their phones like she was part of a joke they couldn't wait to post online. "Are you serious right now?" One of the waitresses snapped loud enough to turn heads. "Lena, he's not a customer. He's a street rat." Another chimed in, giggling. "What's next? Foot rubs for vagrants." The manager stormed out from the back, red-faced and indignant, waving a dish rag like a weapon. "Lena, this isn't a soup kitchen. You're embarrassing the cafe." But she didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't apologize. Because as she looked into the old man's eyes, she saw something deeper than dirt and age and hunger. She saw a man who had been beaten down by time, discarded by a world that measured worth by wallets, not hearts. "He's hungry," she said calmly, standing now, facing the storm with more courage than any of them knew how to name, and that makes him more deserving of help than mockery. The manager barked back, "He hasn't paid for a thing." Lena reached into her pocket, pulling out a handful of crumpled bills and coins, her tips for the day, probably all she had, and placed them on the counter. "He is now..." Gasps rippled through the cafe. Phones stopped recording. Even the mockers fell silent for a breath. Watching this girl with hand-me-down shoes and a borrowed heart give away what little she had just to make a stranger feel human again. And the old man, who had not spoken since entering, looked at her with eyes that shimmered, not from tears, but from something older, deeper, a spark of recognition, of memory, as if somewhere deep inside, He had once known a kindness like this long ago, and thought it had died with the rest of the world. He opened his mouth, voice rough like gravel. "What's your name, child?" She smiled gently. "Lena." He nodded slowly, whispering at once like a prayer. "Lena." And as she turned back to her duties, brushing off the jeers that resumed behind her like flies returning to spoiled fruit, the old man took a careful sip of tea and stared at her with a gaze that held more power than anyone in that room would ever guess. The footage spread like wildfire before Lena even finished her shift. Edited clips of her kneeling beside the beggar, close-up shots of her handing over a pastry, sarcastic captions like "Saint Lena saves the trash" and "Would you let this girl serve your table after touching that?" And by the time she reached the back alley where she always caught the bus home, her phone buzzed nonstop with strangers laughing at her face, her clothes, her kindness turned into comedy, and she stood there frozen, the phone trembling in her hand, unsure if she should cry or scream or throw it into traffic. Back inside the cafe, her coworkers were still chuckling over the comments, one of them reading aloud. "Look, this guy said, maybe the homeless dude is her boyfriend." This followed by a roar of laughter that stabbed harder than any insult, while the manager paced with faux outrage, ranting that Lena had damaged the brand, accusing her of dragging filth into the dining area, threatening to dock her pay, and warning that one more stunt like that and she'd be fired for insubordination. Lena said nothing. She just stood there, head bowed, hands clasped in front of her like a schoolgirl being punished for coloring outside the lines of greed and image. And when she walked home in the rain that night, her shoes soaked and her shoulders bent, not from water, but from shame she hadn't earned, she kept hearing those words. "You're embarrassing the cafe," and "Would you serve that?" echoing like poison in her skull. And yet, even through all of it, even when she collapsed onto the rickety couch in her one-room apartment and buried her face into the same coat she'd wrapped around the old man's shoulders, she didn't regret it. Not 1 second, because the way his hands had stopped shaking, the way his eyes had softened when she called him sir, the way he whispered her name like it mattered, none of that could be faked. But across the city, in a penthouse none of them could imagine, a man sat in front of a wall of screens, watching the same footage in silence, or not laughing, not sneering, just watching, frame by frame, analyzing not the comments, but her eyes, her hands, her hesitation before she gave everything she had to someone the world had already thrown away. And as the clip ended, he leaned back in his chair, removed the disguise makeup from his neck, and whispered to no one. She passed. The next morning, Lena returned to the cafe with swollen eyes and a heavy heart, expecting whispers, more mockery, maybe even a formal write-up from the manager. But instead, the entire place had gone unusually quiet, like the air had thickened with something no one could name. And when she stepped behind the counter, her coworkers looked at her not with sympathy, but with a strange mix of curiosity and unease, like they knew something she didn't. She tied her apron, brushed the hair from her face, and forced a smile as the door chimed open, expecting another stream of caffeine-starved regulars. But instead, a black luxury car slid to a stop outside, its tinted window reflecting the morning sun like obsidian glass, and a man in a sleek navy suit stepped out, not a hair out of place, a clipboard in his hand, his eyes scanning the cafe with the cold precision of someone who didn't waste time. He walked in. Everyone froze. His presence wasn't loud, but it was undeniable, like gravity, like money, like power wrapped in silence. And without looking at anyone else, he strode straight to Lena, who stood speechless beside the espresso machine, her heart crawling up her throat. "Miss Lena," he said calmly, "I've been instructed to personally deliver this." He handed her a cream envelope with her name written in gold. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was an invitation. Thick, embossed, formal. The kind of paper that didn't belong in her world. It read, "You are cordially invited to a private reception at Halton Estate, 7 p.m. this Saturday. Dress code formal. Transportation will be provided." The cafe erupted the moment the man left. "What is this? Some prank? Who do you know at Halton? Did you win a contest or something? But Lena just stood there, stunned, rereading the invitation like it might vanish. Halton Estate wasn't just a mansion. It was a fortress of the elite, a place whispered about in tabloids and locked behind gates the poor never dared approach. The manager rushed over, trying to play nice now, his tone a little too sugary. Lena, if you're connected to someone at Halton, maybe we judge that whole video thing too harshly. But she wasn't listening, because all she could think about was the old man, the look in his eyes, the way he said her name like it mattered. That night, she lay in bed staring at the invitation on her nightstand. Why her who would send this? And what did it have to do with a man the world saw as worthless? But who, in that one moment, had seen her completely far away, at the edge of the city, inside the towering walls of Halton Estate? The old man stood at a grand window in a tailored suit, no longer hunched, no longer ignored, his face clean-shaven, eyes sharp. A butler stepped forward and said, "Sir, the invitation was delivered." And the man nodded slowly, voice calm and certain. "Good. Let the others come too. Let them all see her. And let them see who I really am." Saturday arrived wrapped in golden dusk and nervous energy, and Lena stood at the curb in a simple navy dress she had borrowed from her neighbor. Just enough elegance to not be laughed out of wherever this mysterious invitation would lead, but still plain enough that she felt the weight of every step like an imposter sneaking into a dream that didn't belong to her. And when the black car returned right on time, the driver opened the door with a quiet bow, not looking down at her shoes or judging her second-hand clutch, only saying, "Miss Lena, we've been expecting you." And that alone made her heart pound louder than the engine as she slid into the plush seat, hands clutching her knees, wondering what in the world she had stepped into. The car wound through the city like a shadow before climbing into the hills where the rich hid behind trees and gates. And when it pulled up to Halton Estate, her breath hitched. Because this wasn't just wealth, it was otherworldly. Columns as tall as cathedrals, glass shimmering like diamonds, and a grand staircase bathed in candlelight where sharply dressed guests laughed into champagne flutes and took selfies beneath crystal chandeliers. She hesitated at the base of the stairs until a hostess in black silk approached with a warm smile, took her gently by the arm, and said, "Right this way. Miss Lena, you're tonight's guest of honor." The words nearly knocked her off balance. I think there's a mistake," Lena whispered, but the hostess only smiled wider. "There isn't." Inside, she was led through a ballroom pulsing with golden light and soft music, past women in gowns that cost more than her rent, past men with polished shoes and empty eyes, and as the whispers began, "Who is she? Is that the girl from the video?" She felt the shame rise like a wave until a voice cut through the murmurs, calm and commanding. "That's enough." The room parted. At the center stood the old man. Not in rags, not with trembling hands, but regal, upright, his suit tailored, his face clean, his presence unignorable. "Welcome, Lena," he said, and the crowd gasped in recognition. It was Arthur Halton, media-shy billionaire, founder of Halton Industries, rumored to be reclusive, untouchable, and yet here he stood, offering his hand to the girl they had mocked. "I don't understand," Lena whispered as she stepped closer. "You will," he said, eyes steady. "But first, let them see what kindness really looks like." And as he turned to face the crowd, his voice echoed across the marble. "The young woman you mocked for feeding a beggar fed me. I walked into her cafe in disguise to see if compassion still exists without cameras, without titles, without gain. Only she passed, gasps, murmurs, embarrassed faces turned away." Arthur continued, his voice calm but resolute. "I have wealth beyond measure, but none of it compares to the richness of a heart that gives without expecting applause. Tonight, I introduce you not to a viral joke, but to a future daughter of this family." And as the crowd reeled in stunned silence, a man stepped forward from the edge of the ballroom, tall, poised, handsome, Arthur's son. He smiled at Lena like he already knew her, like he'd been waiting, and her world tilted again. The room spun with disbelief as Daniel Halton, the heir to a billion-dollar empire, stepped toward Lena with a calm so focused it silenced even the most spiteful whispers, his tuxedo crisp, his presence magnetic, but his eyes, those eyes, were fixed only on her, not on her dress, not on her nervous stance, but on the same soul his father had seen that day in the cafe. And Lena, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the moment, could only stare as Daniel approached, extended his hand, and said gently, "I've been waiting to meet you." And before she could respond, the memory of that old man's trembling hands, the cruel laughter of her co-workers, and the shame she swallowed night after night collided with the weight of this truth. None of it had been a coincidence. "You were watching me?" she managed to say, her voice cracking. And Daniel nodded, not ashamed. "My father needed to see kindness with no strings, but I stayed because I saw something else. Courage, grace, a strength I haven't found in boardrooms or ballrooms." The crowd shifted, unsure whether to be impressed or outraged, their rehearsed social games suddenly meaningless in the face of something raw and unmanufactured. Lena stepped back slightly, overwhelmed. "I'm not one of you. I don't belong here." "That's where you're wrong," Arthur said from behind, his voice like thunder wrapped in truth. "You belong here more than most of them ever will." Someone in the crowd scoffed, and a woman in a red gown muttered, "She's a waitress, not royalty." Daniel turned slowly, meeting the woman's eyes with steel. Then, maybe royalty needs redefining. Silence fell again, but it was Lena's voice that broke it next. Not weak, not unsure, but clear. "Why me?" she asked. "Why not someone with power, polish, someone who fits?" Daniel stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his sincerity. Because kindness doesn't need to fit, it just needs to be real. And you, Lena, you're the realest person I've ever met. And in that moment, as the chandelier light danced in her tear-filled eyes, the shame melted from her bones, replaced by something fiercer, dignity, not given, but reclaimed. She didn't take his hand yet, but she didn't step away either. The choice was hers now, and for the first time in her life, every eye in the room waited on her. The music resumed in the background, soft and cautious, like even the instruments were holding their breath, and Lena stood in the center of a world she'd never dared imagine, surrounded by wealth, power, and carefully painted smiles. But none of it mattered as much as the sincerity in Daniel's voice, the quiet pride in Arthur's eyes, and the thunderstorm of doubt still warring in her chest. Because while part of her wanted to believe this was fate, another part, the part shaped by every door slammed in her face and every mocking laugh at her poverty, whispered that this was too good to trust, too perfect to be safe. So she looked at Daniel, heart pounding, and said, "If this is some kind of fairy tale, I don't want the glass slipper. I just want the truth." And Daniel, without missing a beat, replied, "Then let me show you where it leads. No magic, no lies, just you and me." And at that moment, something inside her cracked open, not with surrender, but with acceptance. Because for once, someone wasn't asking her to change or shrink or apologize. They were asking her to choose, and as she took his hand, the room erupted into a wave of confused applause, half genuine, half performative. But Lena didn't flinch this time, didn't care about the cameras or the whispers or the women in designer gowns whispering behind champagne glasses. Because when Daniel led her to the dance floor and held her like she was something precious instead of pitied, something honored instead of humored, she remembered the old man's trembling voice asking her name. And she understood now that the test had never been about who she was in public, but who she remained when no one was watching. And as they swayed beneath chandeliers in disbelief, Lena's eyes found Arthur's once more, and he nodded with a small, knowing smile, as if to say, "You've already won. They're just catching up." The night deepened into velvet and crystal as Lena, still wrapped in disbelief and Daniel's steady arm, moved through the lavish halls of the estate where every corridor whispered wealth and every guest now wore a different mask. Some of admiration, some of envy, some of forced civility. But none of it reached her, because the only gaze that mattered was the one following her with silent pride, Arthur's, standing near the grand staircase, sipping from a glass of water, not wine, his expression calm and unshakable as he watched the very people who had once sneered at her now stumble over themselves to shake her hand, compliment her poise, pretend they hadn't filmed her feeding him with disgust on their faces, and one by one, like a parade of hypocrisy, they approached with empty praise, hoping proximity would cleanse their earlier cruelty, until one voice sliced through the politeness with a venom she had known too well. The cafe manager, red-lipped and wide-eyed, standing awkwardly beside a clutch of socialites, forced to attend only because one of the rich guests brought her as an accessory, and when their eyes met, she faltered, then scoffed. Guess pity pays off after all, loud enough for those nearby to hear, sparking a wave of nervous chuckles. But before Lena could reply, Arthur stepped forward, calm and deliberate, the room quieting as he raised his voice just enough. Miss Lena showed compassion to someone she believed could never repay her. You mocked someone you thought had nothing to offer. Tonight, you're both standing in my house. The difference is, only one of you was invited. The woman's face paled instantly as whispers bloomed like wildfire, and she turned, humiliated, retreating into the shadows where titles and brand names couldn't shield her from the truth. Daniel leaned into Lena's ear and said softly, "My father doesn't raise his voice often. But when he does, it's usually to raise someone else." And Lena, holding back tears, nodded with a quiet strength blooming in her chest. Because the same people who had once reduced her to a viral joke were now watching her rise, not by manipulation or status, but by something far rarer, the kind of character no money could fake, no designer gown could replace, and no cruel voice could diminish. Days passed, then weeks, but the memory of that night never faded. It echoed in the media, in headlines calling her the girl who changed a dynasty and the waitress who passed the Billionaire's test. But none of that mattered to Lena as much as the quiet mornings she now shared with Daniel, walking through gardens where flowers bloomed without permission, where she didn't have to pretend, where she still wore her worn shoes by choice and smiled when the staff greeted her with genuine warmth instead of forced politeness. Because Arthur had made it clear she wasn't just welcomed. She was chosen, and one soft morning, beneath an arch of white magnolias, Daniel turned to her with eyes that no longer belonged to the man who watched from the sidelines, but to someone ready to build a life with her, hand in hand. And as he dropped to one knee, holding a ring not of excess but of intention, he said, "I fell for you before I knew who you were, but I loved you when I saw who you were when no one was watching." And in that breath, with the birds singing and the sunlight breaking through the trees, Lena's heart didn't just say yes. It soared, and when she whispered it aloud, the staff erupted in quiet applause, and Arthur, watching from the balcony with his hand resting gently on the railing, allowed a rare smile to bloom, the kind that held the pride of a father who didn't just find a daughter-in-law, but a legacy. And as Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, Lena didn't feel like a charity case, or a waitress, or a girl who once gave away her only pastry. She felt like exactly what she had always been beneath the noise enough, worthy, chosen not for appearances or lineage, but for her heart, her courage, her refusal to let the world decide her value. And that was the real proposal, that she never had to change to be loved. The wedding wasn't held in a cathedral or a 5-star resort, but in the very garden where Daniel had proposed, under the same arch of white magnolias, now adorned with soft golden lights and the laughter of those who mattered. And as Lena walked down the aisle in a gown simple yet radiant, sewn with threads of her mother's favorite blue beneath the hem, every step was a victory over every whisper, every sneer. Every night she went to sleep, wondering if kindness was still worth it in a world that too often rewarded cruelty. And at the altar stood Daniel, eyes glistening, not with pride in her transformation, because she had not transformed, but with reverence for the girl who had shown him what wealth without purpose truly lacked. And beside him stood Arthur, not as a billionaire, but as a father, eyes proud, hand steady, the man who once disguised himself in rags now standing in full light to present her not just as a daughter-in-law, but but as the future heart of everything his name stood for, and as vows were exchanged, not lofty or poetic, but honest and trembling. Lena's voice cracked only once. When she said, "You didn't choose me because I was perfect. You chose me because I stayed kind when no one was looking." And Daniel whispered back, "That's the only kind of perfect I've ever needed." And when the applause rose and the kiss sealed the promise, the sky above bloomed with soft golden fireworks that sparkled like the tears in Arthur's eyes. And later, when the crowd had thinned and the night had turned still, Lena sat with Arthur beneath the stars, her head resting lightly on his shoulder, and he whispered, "You gave me back hope, my dear, not just for Daniel, but for this world." And she smiled, taking his weathered hand, and replied, "You never lost it. You just needed someone to remind you." And in that quiet moment, where legacy met grace and love rose from the simplest act of compassion, it became clear to everyone who knew the story that what had started with a cup of tea and a warm pastry had not only changed a family, so it had rewritten what it means to be truly rich. They mocked her for being kind when no one was watching. They humiliated her for helping someone they deemed unworthy. But in the end, she didn't just earn love, she earned legacy. Because the richest hearts don't live in mansions, they live among ordinary people, who choose kindness anyway.